So good evening. My name is Iris de Rode, and welcome to the French-American Histories. It's a program of virtual talks and a little bit of public, of course. That will be monthly, and it's launched by the Embassy of France, but also Villa Albertine and the Federation of the Alliance Françaises in the USA. So a little bit of history, and then we'll go to the introduction.
Of course.
So 240 years ago, fighting side by side for American independence, France was the first ally of the newly formed United States of America. Since then, the two countries have stood firm as sister republics, championing shared principles of democracy, freedom, and equality. This durable partnership has been characterized by a shared ambition and, of course, a common necessity for cooperation in a wide variety of fields, spanning from economic policy, military relations, agriculture, trade, philosophy, art, movies, film, television. All these different exchanges have resulted in dynamic and very fruitful and inspirational cross exchanges between these two nations that have shaped the destiny of both countries. So each episode of this series will focus on different facets of these vibrant French-American stories by interviewing leading scholars, excerpts, and of course also diplomats and other practitioners. And so this month, we're very honored to have Ambassador Charles Rivkin for this interview today. So I'm going to give a short introduction and then we'll go into the interview.
Okay.
So after spending his junior year of high school in Rennes in France, Charles Rivkin received his bachelor degree from Yale University and then an MBA from Harvard University. And prior to entering in government service, Rivkin worked in the media sector for over 20 years, serving as president and CEO of different entertainment companies, amongst which the Jim Henson Company, then home of the Muppets, of which I was a big fan, of course, as a child. Charles Rivkin served as a U.S. ambassador to France and Monaco between 2009 and 2013 during Barack Obama's presidency. And between 2014 and 17, Rivkin served as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs. Today, he is the chairman and CEO of Motion Picture Association, the leading advocate of the global film, television, and streaming industry. Current MPA members include Disney, Netflix, Paramount, Sony, Universal, and Warner Brothers Discovery. Rivkin also serves on the boards of American Academy of Diplomacy, the American Film Institute, Via Transportation, Inc., and is member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. And so today, in today's conversation, we will delve into his remarkable professional journey to explore diverse facets of the Franco-American relationships. So this interview promises a deeper understanding of historical ties, but also the future prospects between the two nations through the lens of a seasoned diplomat, industry leader, and of course, as we say in France, un francophile. Okay, so the first question I would like to ask is more of a personal nature.
Sure.
Your journey has been incredibly rich and diverse, as of course I've just outlined, from your role in the media sector to U.S. Ambassador to France, and then to Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, to your current involvement in the film industry as CEO of the Motion Picture Association. So how did your early experiences shape your path towards diplomacy and later into the realm of cinema?
Well, Iris, first of all, I'm thrilled to be here. When I'm in the French embassy in Washington, I feel like I'm home. And I want to thank Ambassador Laurent Billy for having me today. And I appreciate the chance to talk about my experiences. To answer your question, I want to go a little bit further back to talk about French ties. My father, William Rivkin, was part of General Patton's army that liberated Paris. And I was reading letters he wrote when he was 19 years old home. And he wrote really excitedly that he just heard Charles de Gaulle on the radio saying, Paris outragé, Paris brisé, Paris martyrisé, mais Paris libéré. And he was there for that, which is amazing. There's a picture in my office of him in front of the Arc de Triomphe through the liberation. My father went on to become the United States ambassador to Luxembourg under President Kennedy. I went there when I was a very young boy. And after that, when Kennedy passed away, when Kennedy was killed, he was reappointed by President Johnson to Senegal and the Gambia. And so Luxembourg Senegal, and the Gambia, all Francophone countries that I lived in when I was a very young child. But unfortunately, my father died while serving as ambassador in Dakar in the embassy. And at the time, the vice president of the United States was Hubert Humphrey, who was my father's one of his best friends. And so he created an award at the U.S. State Department in 1968 called the Rivkin Award, which celebrates intellectual courage and constructive dissent. And I say this because there's not, I don't think, an exact word for dissent in French. Désaccord is close, but it's not exactly it. But it basically is the only award given in all of the U.S. government that honors somebody who disagrees with the U.S. government, which I'm very proud of. But I mention all this because I never knew my dad, and yet I wanted to follow in his footsteps because I was so impressed by what he wrote. He wrote that serving the country at the highest level, serving as an ambassador, was the highest honor you could ever aspire towards. And I wrote my college essay. You mentioned I went to Yale. I wrote the essay on becoming an ambassador one day, never thinking that I would. And I did live in France, as you said, but to have been named ambassador of France was not only wild, it was beyond my wildest dreams. But in between then, because after I'd filed this resume, I started working in business. And after getting out of business school, I, as you said, joined the entertainment industry. And I did meet a man named Jim Henson there, who was the creator of the Muppets. And Jim had a philosophy. He said that media, if used properly, can be an enormous source for good in the world. And he proved that with Sesame Street and all the Muppet characters where, you know, the good guy always won, nobody got beheaded. It was a happy time. And he had a big influence on my life. And the lesson of media being used properly served me well in France, which I can talk about later on if you'd like. Mm-hmm. But while I was in these entertainment companies that I was running, that was my day job. But my night job was I was still fascinated by government and politics. And I ran into this guy named Barack Hussein Obama. He was an unlikely candidate for president. People who didn't know him thought of Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden. They didn't understand the name. He was not comfortable for the American electorate. But he called me and he said, because I had been very involved in the Kerry campaign 4 years earlier, and my name was on a number of lists. And he said, I want you to help me win this election in Southern California. And I said, well, Senator, which he was at the time, why you and why now? You're young, you can do anything with your life. And he said, because the day I am elected president of the United States, instead of a guy that was last in the polls, the world's going to look at us differently, and we're going to look at ourselves differently as well. And I mention all of this because when I went to France, before his inauguration, America had an 11% approval rating. And the day after his inauguration, it soared to 92% overnight. And I will tell you, as an ambassador, it's a lot easier when the wind is at your sails, when the country where you're representing America likes the president. The doors are much, are open. But it was amazing. And then, as it turns out, I only supported two political candidates in my entire life nationally. One was Obama, and the other was John Kerry, who became Secretary of State. So at the end of Obama's first term, Secretary Kerry asked me to serve, as you said, as the Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs. I had a chance to travel to 40 different countries, 70 cities, promoting economic growth. But I also was in charge of the digital economy from the State Department's perspective, trade, and copyright, which played nicely into this new job I have. And the last thing I'll say in this eclectic journey is, I guess you could say I went from working for a pig and a frog to the President of the United States. Kermit and Piggy would maybe not be offended by that comment, but it is an eclectic resume. But when I left the State Department after serving for 8 years, I thought, is there a job that marries the two things that I love? I love government and politics, but I also love entertainment. And the truth is, there was a job. The entertainment industry had a vacancy in the Motion Picture Association, and I got a chance to be the 6th CEO of the MPA in a 102-year existence. And I'm incredibly lucky, but it's fun because in some ways, I now serve as Hollywood's ambassador to Washington and to the world.
Very impressive journey indeed. So talking about your ambassadorship in France, of course, you said that there was a high approval rate. You had a sort of easy task is not the right word, but it was positive environment, but could you maybe highlight some of your more challenging diplomatic situations or those that you remember being?
Well, look, when you represent America to our oldest ally and one of our closest allies, sure, there's a lot of commonalities, and there's a lot of things go well, and there wasn't every day a problem, but I did run into a number of tough issues, and I'll talk about them. I've never actually talked about these publicly before, but I guess I'm 10 years out of post, and it's probably safe. But I was the ambassador when WikiLeaks hit. And what's fascinating about that actually is at my embassy, we would send thousands of cables home to Washington certainly by every month. There was just an entire barrage of cables coming out of these embassies, especially big ones like the one in Paris. And every cable was signed by me, even though I never really saw the cables. Because protocol in the US government is that the ambassador is responsible for everything that happens at post. So his name is at the bottom of the cable. When those cables get released, it sure looks like I had personal views of a whole bunch of things. Many of them I never even knew about. I didn't even know these cables existed because I didn't approve many of them. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, that was my job. And so when it hit, there were some unkind things said about President Sarkozy. And I remember that the New York Times ran 5 days of WikiLeaks. If you go back in history and look at it, it's in WikiLeaks in Iran, WikiLeaks about North Korea, WikiLeaks about Gulf countries, and I don't remember what the other hotspot was, but the fifth was France. And so one of my favorite former French ambassadors in the United States, Jean-David Lévite, was the counselor to the president at the time. And he pretty much saved my job because he was able to translate for President Sarkozy the cables that spoke well of President Sarkozy to show that it wasn't just us, criticizing. But I learned a lot from that experience. Many of the diplomats would say, "Why does America have to share so much in their cables? And why are you so prolific, Charlie?" And hard to answer the first question, but the second one is because I had ghostwriters. But that was interesting, and it took some time to get over. WikiLeaks was tough, and then of course Snowden came later. Mm-hmm. So I was there for both of those unfortunate ruptures. Similarly, a tough issue I faced was it was important for us to support, have our allies support America's effort in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And so we encouraged our allies to increase their troop levels as we increased ours. But then, as you remember, there was a surge from American troops, and then American government felt that after the surge, the Americans should be able to pull their troops out first. Allies didn't love that idea because they'd been there a long time, and so you surged, fine, but we've been there too, we want to pull out. So we would have to argue with our government officials about how important that was. I felt the best way to make my argument was to actually fly to Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So Admiral Stavridis was in charge he was the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe at the time, and he invited me down to stay in Kabul, and we're staying in these bunkers with sandbags. And I remember going up on a troop carrying helicopter that has an enormous heat signature, and you have a giant Marine in the back with a gun, and then two Marines in the side that have guns, and I said to the Marine, look, I almost fried myself walking onto this thing. The heat signature is intense. If you had a heat-seeking missile to come after this copter, how would you protect? And he goes, well, my job is to make sure that I'm shooting enough of the ground that someone will think twice about aiming at us. But it didn't comfort me, But we flew on these. They were called Chinook helicopters, and we flew to the training camps and to the areas where the French troops are located. So I had a chance to speak to the French troops in country, and I had the ability to come back to the Élysée Palace and say, well, look, I was just on the ground with your guys, and here's what they said. And it actually made a big difference in my advocacy, and it ended up resolving okay. But a third one that I wanted to mention is also, I haven't mentioned this story much, but it's I was there during the Libyan crisis, and there was a Libyan temporary government that was formed after Gaddafi was killed. And so they were going to Paris, and Hillary Clinton was in Paris. And so she says she wanted to meet with the interim government in the U.S. residence, in the ambassador's residence, because this is just before she goes over to the Élysée to see Sarkozy. And because it wasn't a bilateral issue, it was a multilateral issue, and I wasn't in the room. I was upstairs. So I get a call from Jean David, who was the counselor of the president, Jean David Levitte, and he said, "Charlie, where's Hillary?" And I said, well, she's at the Élysée. She should be at the Élysée. She's not there. You must find out immediately. Where's Hillary? And so I go downstairs and I see that, and sure enough, the Libyans and Hillary, they were all still in the main, one of the main dining rooms of the residence. And I told Hillary's team that the Élysée was calling. They have to get going. But before I could say any more, Jean David always spoke to me in English because he was the former ambassador here. He was the ambassador at the UN. His English is better than mine. And it was sort of foolish for me to try to speak to him in French. So when Jean David called me and he said, "Monsieur l'ambassadeur, je vous présente le président de la République," I knew that Jean David wasn't happy. And so I then get screamed at by President Sarkozy, the details of which are not important for this discussion. But he was, let's just say he was unhappy with me that I was unable to get Hillary to this meeting that I wasn't even a part of. So, but still, he expressed his anger. The next day, I called Jean David and I said, "Look, I think I was in Deauville at a film festival. And I said, I get yelled at by a lot of people. I have a pretty thick skin. But when the president of France yells at the American ambassador, who's the personal representative of the president of the United States, you're yelling at the president of the United States. And I need to understand that we're okay." And so Jean David said, "Charlie, you're now part of a small club of people that got yelled at by Sarkozy. I'm in this club," he says, "but don't worry, everything will be blue sky." Well, here's what the blue sky ended up being. On the 10th anniversary of 9/11, I had, that's when this took place, I had arranged for François Fillon, who was the prime minister at the time, to speak with me at the residence in front of the whole press corps and a number of the cabinet members about the 10th anniversary. And so I got a call from Jean David, and this is going to happen the next day. And I got a call from Jean David, and he said, "Okay, I remember I told you we do something nice. Well, President Sarkozy will now speak, and Fillon will not speak." And I go, "But it was in the press, and everybody knows. I mean, this will look like it won't be good for Mr. Fillon." And he goes, "This is not your problem. This is what's decided." And so Fillon was not happy, but President Sarkozy came to the residence, which he never did, because it was protocol to come when the president came, but it was not protocol to come without the president. But he came to the residence, and the two of us spoke to the French press corps and to the cabinet. And President Sarkozy told a beautiful story about what America means to him, and how important 9/11 was to friends of America, and how supportive he was of us. And I had it translated into English, and I sent it to President Obama, just because it was a real love letter about America. But all those issues were when they were in process, they were quite scary, but they all resolved well. Those are just three examples.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about D-Day. So as we approach the 80th anniversary of the historic D-Day landings in 2024, so next year, of course, the world will, of course, once again reflect on this pivotal moment in history. And as someone who honored this event in 2012, during the 68th anniversary, Ambassador Rivkin himself participated in a parachute jump over Normandy during, of course, your tenure as the ambassador. So could you share your thoughts on the enduring legacy of D-Day and its significance in relations, but also maybe share that particular moment that you actually jumped?
All right, I will. By the way, I never got approval for that. Oh. And had I called the State Department or the president, I would not have gotten approval for that. But I did it because, well, first of all, when you go to Saint-Mère-Église on D-Day, and many of people have seen it, there's a parachute hanging from the steeple there, which was what happened during the when the Americans came through, and but they have that parachute still there as a symbol. And 24/7, 12 months a year, the people that live in that region remain so grateful to the United States for having saved the day. But I'll tell you that the story is there are more Americans buried in France than in any other country on earth except America, because of our role in World War I, World War II, et cetera. And so we have, I think, 15 or more cemeteries. And the American Battlefield Monument Commission works for the ambassador, or was under the supervision of the ambassador. And I went to France saying I was going to help our men and women of the armed forces the best I could and promote collaboration between France and America that way. And so my defense attaché says, well, I'm going to take you up on your statement. I'm going to see, whether you really mean what you said, because I want you to jump from 14,000 feet with the U.S. Army's Golden Knights on the 68th anniversary of D-Day. And I'm terrified of heights. That was not something that I had in my to-do list. It was not in my bucket list. But it was important to him, and it was important to the men and women of the armed forces who were serving, because it was a way of showing how close our collaboration was and has always been with the French. And so I jumped with the Knights. It was like 22-mile-an-hour winds. People were being blown off course, but I had this guy with me, and it was I think it was safe. But you know what? I fell over these fields that looked exactly the same as they must have looked 68 years earlier, except that it was daytime. I didn't have guns on my back. I wasn't being shot at. I couldn't compare that to the heroic efforts of our armed forces, of course. But I got a visceral sense of it because falling left and right were all these veterans, and landed in front of a crowd of 25,000 people, and did a live interview in French on French television, talking about why this was important. And if you are bored and choose to type in Rivkin parachute, you can actually see the whole thing, because you'll see exactly how terrified I was. But in my book, doing something that you're not scared of requires no bravery. So I was proud of myself that I was able to actually overcome fears and make that happen. But more importantly, it drew a lot of media attention to the fact that we owe France our existence, and in some ways, the favor was partly returned in the various other encounters. So yeah, that was a moment for sure.
Yes, and how do you believe this commemorating such a milestone, D-Day, or what you're referring to, the alliance between France and America, is that important in today's world for the relations between the two nations?
Well, I mean, so one of the 25,000 people that watched me land was the then Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus of the American Navy, and he said, well, that's nice, but you've never flown an F-18 Super Hornet. And I said, well, I can't fly in a Super Hornet because you have to land and take off on a carrier, which no civilian can do. And if you do that, you got to be water trained for 6 months. And he goes, well, I'll waive the training. And I said, well, Mr. Secretary, if you're going to waive the training, why do you have training? And he goes, look, here's the thing. You're going to take off on this ship, and if the danger is when you take off and when you land, and what'll happen is the plane will flip over, hit the water, you probably die. So the training won't help you. Don't worry about it. Sure.
Reassuring.
But I mean, come on, how often would that happen? So I landed on the carrier in an F-18 Super Hornet, which the only other person that's done that, honestly, is who's not in active military duty, is when Bush 43 landed on the carrier for the mission accomplished speech. But you land on the carrier, and then we took off. We did supersonic travel, wing to wing refueling. It was an incredible moment. But I'm up in the sky, by the way, as an aside, and the pilot, his name was Bert. I remember because I used to, help with Sesame Street. Bert, and I'm in the back. If you guys have seen, anybody in the audience has seen Top Gun Maverick, there's a guy named Bob. Bob was in the back, and so there's the exact planes they flew, the F-18 Super Hornets, and Bob was, you don't need the guy in the back, but that's where I was. When I sat in the plane, they said, whatever you do, don't push this button because that will drop the fuel out of the plane. And you don't want to do that. Don't push this button because it'll blow the canopy off, and you don't want to do that. And definitely don't push this button because that's the ejector seat button. Yeah. So when I'm up in the sky and I'm saying to Bert, I said, Bert, let me ask you a question, honestly. I'm microphone, whatever, the intercom, whatever you call it. And I said, if you like flying so much, why didn't you join the Air Force? And he didn't respond, but he just went, and you realize at that moment that these planes are not, they're rockets. They're controlled rockets. They're not, because they wouldn't float if the engine stopped, but they can turn on a dime. It went straight up. It did a backward loop, and it ended upside down, scraping the clouds. And then it popped back up, and he goes, did I answer your question? I said, well, sir, you did not answer my question, but it was a hell of a ride. And he said, he goes, what I just did would have been illegal if it was over American soil in 8 different states. And he said, if you want to fly, Mr. Ambassador, you got to be a naval aviator. But the reason I say this is that The reason I was on that carrier is there was interoperability exercises with the Charles de Gaulle. At the time, there were 11 Nimitz-class aircraft carriers in the U.S. Navy, and the only other nuclear aircraft carrier in the world was France, and it has its Charles de Gaulle. And so we were doing interoperabilities where the Rafale jets were landing on board of the Truman, where I was, and then the F-18 Super Hornets were landing on the Charles de Gaulle. And so these types of military exercises are promoting not only interoperability, but connectivity between our two armed forces, which was really important. That's a long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah. No, but it also illustrates this importance of that military cooperation since 250 years up until today, of course. So, yeah. And so your engagement with youth in France, and especially in the marginalized communities and in the banlieue, is praiseworthy. You've done a lot of different efforts and started many programs there. So can you tell us more about your programs and their impact and why you considered this important in France and in particular, of course, for the broader French-American relations?
Honestly, the original concept was what they called CVE, countering violent extremism. And the point was that the more these cultures understand each other, the less hatred there would be. So, for example, our movie stars and our movies are seen around the world, but nobody really looks at these individuals and thinks they're Americans. They think they're movie stars. And but nonetheless, I was out there in the banlieue, and I was talking about America, and they were angry at France. They said the French government never comes out here, and it's true. Actually, I had armed bodyguards, and it was a little bit of a dangerous place at the time. And but they never come visit, and you know, we don't like the French. I don't want to talk about that. That's not my job. So I said, "What do you like about America?" And they go, "What do we like about America? We like Samuel Jackson, Will Smith, will.i.am, Jodie Foster, Woody Allen." And I said, "All right, I'm going to come back here with these guys one day." And I remember they looked at me and these kids, and they said, "Monsieur l'ambassadeur, langue de bois." And for those of you that don't speak French, saying langue de bois, wooden tongue, is sort of like what a normal politician is. He just doesn't tell the truth. And so the next day, coincidentally, I got a call from Latanya Jackson, Samuel Jackson's wife, and she says, "Ambassador, we're coming to Paris. We'd love to go to lunch." And I go, "We can go to lunch, but we're going to go to the banlieue first." And so we got in the car. And Jackson wasn't really thrilled, but his wife made the decision for him. And so we get out there, and I had 2 armored cars, 2 motorcycle, backups, and we went to Bondy, I think this time, and Jackson gets out of the car with the sunglasses on, and everyone starts yelling, "Big Mac, Big Mac," because for those of you who have seen Pulp Fiction, that was one of the favorite films. And so Sam Jackson gave him a bit of a tough love message, a message that a U.S. ambassador couldn't say. He said, "Listen, just stop your complaining, you guys, and just get off your butt." And they're like, "Mr. Jackson, you don't understand. I'm a person of color, and I don't get jobs here." And he goes, "Well, look at me, and look what I had to do my whole life, working. But I worked at it. I believed in it. The French dream and the American dream are the same. You just have to believe in yourself and get to work, and just stop blaming it on somebody else." I couldn't say messages like that, but he said that, and it made a tremendous amount of press. And so I then continued to deliver on my promise, and I came back with Jodie Foster, whose French is fantastic. We came back with Clint Eastwood. We were there with will.i.am and Will Smith, and a number of musicians. We had Tony Bennett, Mary J. Blige, Aloe Black, and then Maya Angelou came, and all these people, helped share their perspective on America, which was incredibly helpful. So, Sam Jackson and all the people that came went from being 2-dimensional movie stars to being flesh and blood Americans who are like them, and it showed that kind of commonality. That people-to-people exchange was able to be realized through film because you could identify with it a lot more. And not every actor is a great ambassador of our country, but these ones were absolutely so.
Very interesting. And so how do you perceive that impact of cultural diplomacy, which of course that example is, on international relations, and how has this informed your approach to global engagement in the entertainment industry in your role today? So shifting, of course, from ambassador to the CEO of Motion Pictures Association.
Well, actually, going back to cultural diplomacy, I remember having some feisty conversations with the culture minister at the time. I'm thinking of was Mitterrand. Frédéric was there, and he is an amazing person. But we were debating because I said that if you want to protect and preserve French culture, in my humble opinion, you should export French culture. Mm. And he says, we don't do this. This is le 7e art. This is not commerce. We're not selling this is art. And I said, well, but if you stop us from coming in, because they were doing things like limiting the number of American films, not allowing us to advertise, making it harder for our country to be in, because they didn't want our culture to overwhelm France's culture. And then flash forward, now I'm at the Motion Picture Association. When I was a kid, I couldn't watch any French television or film. It was very rare to have it, in my hometown of Chicago at the time. And we certainly didn't have anything like streaming, and there was only 3 networks. I guess I'm pretty old. So but now, Le Bureau des Légendes, the Bureau as they call it here, one of the best series ever involving the DGSE, the French Intelligence Services. My former members of the CIA that were in Embassy Paris tell me that it is the best depiction of French intelligence that's ever been on television, and it can be watched. It's a stunning series. Lupin, right? Lupin is something that French all know about, but nobody very few outside of France could really identify. And Netflix's series has been an enormous hit, and people have curiosity about it. You look at 10%, Call My Agent. Big hit, and it's even been franchised in different countries around the world. So French culture, thanks honestly to American streaming services, is being beamed everywhere. There was at one point, the term jet setting. Now people are calling it set jetting, because people want to go off and jet to the sets where these things are made. Emily in Paris, as much as the French hated it, but at the same time watched it, was a love letter to France, the way that Paris was filmed. And people want to go to things like that. So on a cultural level, on a tourism level, it's wonderful. But to me, culture and economics are 2 of the most important things that bind nations together. The French would argue that les Frères Lumière were the ones who created cinema. We would argue it was Thomas Edison around the exact same time, but it doesn't really matter, because both America and France have been engaged in telling creative stories through film since the beginning of the medium itself. And I have my colleague in the audience today, Stan McCoy, who runs our EMEA operation and is very, very involved in Cocoa, the City of Lights, City of Angels film festival that we do with the embassy in Los Angeles to celebrate that, and the French American Cultural Fund, which is very important to us as well. So I see this both in my current job as well as in my previous job, how important those cultural ties are.
And could you share some insights on the collaborative efforts between the 2 countries today? You mentioned some of the French, of course, being streamed here in the US, but are there French-American collaborations on film or television? And do these partnerships contribute to these cultural exchanges and economic prosperity, as you said?
They absolutely do. Absolutely do. Do you know, we've done some economic impact studies. People, not everybody that I meet in Europe knows that the MPA has been part of the European cultural ecosystem for film for the last 100 years. We've been partnering with European countries and companies for a very, very, very long time. And now we're making a ton of new investments thanks to our streaming services. And so one example that I came across the other day is there's an HBO series that you should all watch if you haven't, called Irma Vep. And Irma Vep, based on a film directed by Olivier Assayas, contributed 42 million euros to French GDP from being made in France, and hired about 3,000 French people. Every million euros invested in France generates about €1.5 million in the supply chain. Because, and to use a different example in the United States, when we film a movie anywhere in America, in a large city in America, it generates about $700,000 a day, a shooting day of economic activity, because we're talking about caterers, hairdressers, electricians, plumbers, makeup artists. These are these working class jobs that make up our industry. It's not the stars on the carpet; it's the people behind the scenes. And those jobs are real jobs. They're high-paying jobs. they're sustainable, and that many of the jobs in the entertainment industry you can have without having gotten a college degree. So the industry, every time we make a movie anywhere in the world or a television series, it dramatically increases the economic activity. Mm-hmm. So that goes for us in every country, but also when the French make movies elsewhere too.
Yes. And maybe to conclude, because then we'll go to the questions of the audience here, but also those on Zoom. You can ask questions in the little text, how do you call it, chat box in the Zoom. And so to conclude, of course, it is evident that the French-American relations have navigated challenges, but also have, of course, a lot of cooperation and a lot of positive elements to them. So considering this evolving geopolitical landscape we're in today, with new conflicts, with tensions, alongside complexities of the new election year, of course, in the United States, how do you envision the role of enduring alliances, so the French-American alliance particularly, in shaping this global stability and fostering cooperation amid all these shifting dynamics and challenges?
It's interesting. While I'm in DC, the whole AUKUS affair took place. Not while I was ambassador, of course, I was just astonished to see the ambassadors recalled. I mean, that hasn't happened in I don't know how long, maybe ever. And it just reminds you how important it is to maintain the relationships, how important it is to have great communication at all levels, including the ambassadorial level. And I remember that when the ambassadors were called back in place, Philippe Etienne was here, and I was invited to a very small event just afterwards, after he came back to town, in the French ambassador's residence, where Philippe Etienne pinned the Légion d'honneur on the Secretary of State Tony Blinken's mother's chest, and she's wonderful. Edith Pizarre Judith Pizarre is not only a friend, but she's a real force in France, and this meant a tremendous amount to her, and it was also very symbolic of the friendship. So it's amazing how even gestures can bring these countries together. I'm reminded of a quote by l'Abbé Pierre, who said, if I get this right, "L'amitié, c'est ce qui vient au cœur quand on fait ensemble des choses belles et difficiles." And a rough translation is that friendship really comes to the heart when together you work on things that are both complicated and difficult, but also beautiful. And in some ways, it's much better in French. But in some ways, that's what the relationship has been like. We have always had our differences, like any country does, like any family does. But at the end of the day, the French-American relationship is so strong that it can never, because we were both born in liberty of our own free will. I remember when I got to France, the press were so excited about Obama that they were saying to me, "Mr. Ambassador, you don't understand. This is why we helped your birth. This is worthy of the charter of your original country, having such a man as president of the United States." There's such pride that they helped bring the America that they want to see to life. So that friendship will last forever. There's so many things that we can do together on the global stage as allies, as partners, because France is truly the leader in Europe at this point. That I think will strengthen. You can name any crisis that exists right now in the world, and France and America are side by side. Yeah. So anyway, I am forever. When I was fortunate enough to get the Légion d'honneur by President Hollande, he said that I am now his ambassador in America, and I interpret that in the most positive way, and it's true. I'm always here talking about not only how extraordinary France is, but how amazing the relationship, the enduring relationship between our countries is today and will be forever.
Well, thank you very much for this interview and for this important role as ambassador to France, in France, and everywhere else.